Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode here. I am grateful to be here once again as your host. And I'm also grateful because without my listeners, there is no podcast. Before I get too far in, if you are new to this episode, I invite you to go ahead and subscribe. If you find this episode valuable, I often invite people to share this with a friend, a colleague, a department, a family member, and leave a review and a comment. I want to talk about what I'm going to talk about today. I have been thinking about this world of assumptions because of all that is going on in our nation and our society today. And so, if you followed me on this podcast, if you've heard my TEDx talk, if you've heard me speak on any of the stages that I've spoken on, whether it be in your organization or whether it be on a common stage like a conference, you know that I always talk about this idea, this concept of how our brain filters information. And so, assuming is what we do. It is the automaticity that the brain engages in is assumptions. But when we are unaware of our assuming, when we're unaware because of the filters that are behind our assuming, then that can actually lead us down the path of reckless thinking, of reckless and even dangerous thinking. Okay. And as I, talk about assumptions today, there are a couple of places where I want to tap on. And one is the assumption of intent, and the second is assumption of authority. Now, I may or may not address that in any particular order or go back and forth. But what I want to start with is this assumption of authority. And we see a lot of this right now just in the way that we interact on social media. And one of the things that I see is that a post will happen. There will be a post, and that post is a declaration of something that has happened of truth. And sometimes the post is made with context, and sometimes the post is made without context. Now, oftentimes, people in general will take that post and they will take it as the truth, the ultimate truth, rather than taking time to examine the context and even doing a little bit more research. So this is assumption of authority, assuming that the person who posts is the authority or obviously got it from a reputable source. And this is one of, I think, a critical thing that if is not interrupted leads to reckless thinking, leads to reckless assumption of authority. Because what happens, and I don't know if you've ever played this game of telephone or rumor, or it goes by many names, where you have a group of people in a room and one person whispers in the ear of the next person. And that person is to take that message and whisper into the ear all the way down the line. And at the end of the line, the person says out loud what the original message was supposed to be. And oftentimes, it is far from that. Okay? And so what happens is without clarification and or verification, a message can get wildly distorted. And what is there to verify and what is there to clarify? Well, there's verification of context and there's verification of source. And so when we don't do that, when we take what is put right in front of us without further investigation, without further critical thinking, then our process becomes reckless because we're not examining fully and we're not even taking into consideration our own values and beliefs. We're just taking what's put in front of us and running with it. And then maybe telling someone else, further distorting it. And that is how rumors get created. And so I think it's important. We can look at this in the context of an organization where someone says something and it is not questioned, there's not the safety inside of the organization, the psychological safety, especially if it hits someone in a particular way, that it's assumed to be true because a person in a particular position said it, then that can get passed on and passed on and passed on and distorted along the way. And there you have a completely different communication and a culture that can be fractured with assumptions. So that moves me sort of into this other arena of assumption, which is assumption of intent. And when I was a clinical practicing physician, as most of you know by now, I'm a physician by training. I practiced for 15 years, and I chose to. I know I don't look that old, but yes, I did practice for 15 years. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided to step away from my practice and sell my practice, and then I stayed on for a few years, and then I fully left clinical medicine about 4 to 5 years ago. Okay, so when I was in practice and when I owned my practice, I would get patients that came in. And for those of you who don't know, my specialty is family medicine, but what my practice specialized in was integrative medicine. And so I would get a lot of patients who would come to me with issues or problems or concerns that may not have been able to been resolved inside of the traditional clinical visit. And so they would come to me looking for expanded, maybe more integrative, like acupuncture, nutritional type, or supplemental type answers. And I would see them and help them. And typically, I would send them right back to their PCP, and there would be communication. However, oftentimes when patients would come to me, they would have an assumption of intent of their specialist or their primary care physician. And that assumption was that because their physician couldn't solve the problem, that they were number one, either incompetent, or number two, they didn't care. And so oftentimes I spend a lot of time educating and right sizing my patients to say, the level of knowledge that I had gained was because of further study in the integrative studies and the functional medicine domain. And this was before, bear in mind, integrative medicine was a specialty and functional medicine was more mainstream. I was doing this work when it was still a fringe. And so explaining this to patients, giving them wider context, help them to right size their thinking. When we assume intent, when we assume, and this is an assumption towards physicians that happens a lot. There's a lot of assumption that physicians don't care, that physicians don't want to hear what you have to say, that physicians are only concerned about the money. Their only concern is shuffling patients through. And I'm here to tell you that that is a wide untruth. And so, one of the things that it's important to understand is that without a wider context, there can be a lot of false assumptions that leads to dangerous thinking, that can lead to very, very harmful consequences. And so, when we see patients in practices or in hospitals becoming disgruntled at physicians and attacking them, thinking that the physician is the source of the wider problem of a broken healthcare system, that it causes a lot of harm and it doesn't improve the state of healthcare. Without getting too far down the rabbit hole of healthcare, it's just an example, it's just a microcosm of what can happen when we assume intent. And so, what do you do? What do you do is you clarify intention. Now, that's not to say that there isn't malintent happening. That's not to say that there aren't cases where a doctor or a patient, for that matter, or a system has malintention, because we do know that humans are humans, and there will be good intentions and there will be malicious intentions. But by and large, we can assume person to person, organization to organization, system to system. We can't assume what the intention is until we verify and clarify. And so, my invitation, or my, I guess, plea in essence, is to look deeper and ask questions. And this is the value of really expanding our communication intelligence, our listening intelligence, our emotional intelligence. Because here's the thing, when people who are in an intense circumstance and they are activated, like a previous trauma or a previous bad experience activates their nervous system, the system that is wanting to keep us safe, then if a person doesn't have the capacity or the skills to regulate themselves and go about that act of clarification or verification, then that emotional hijack will bypass all order of higher thinking. And so before that happens, it's important to begin the process of learning to expand those skill sets, learning to expand the toolbox of communication. And by communication, I do mean listening and clarifying and asking powerful questions so that we don't get consumed or overtaken by our own false assumptions. And if you are on the receiving end of that false assumption and you can detect either from a person's tone or a person's body language that something, and this is again, this is the importance of our listening, not just with our ears, but also with our eyes. And we call this sensory acuity, having the awareness that something has shifted in a person as you're speaking to them, or shifted in a crowd and in an audience, and even in an organization. When you're speaking to them, when you have the level of sensory acuity and awareness and listening with one's eyes to be able to detect a shift and a change, then you can clarify the response. And so this building of skill sets is what helps us to be mindful of our assumptions. And so the first step really is just to recognize that we're always assuming. We're always making assumptions and building stories and building meaning, because that is what our brain does. That is the automaticity of our brain. And so when we can really understand that from moment to moment, when a person is speaking, we're building a story, then we can also learn to pause. And especially now, here's where there can be some practice, is that we can listen to our body and how things land with our body. And then if it lands some kind of way that is uncomfortable or that's activating, rather than reacting, we can pause and clarify. We can pause and verify. Okay, I just heard this. Is that what you just said? Okay, I just felt this. It felt like you meant this. Am I making up that meaning? Or or is there something else that you meant by this? Or can you clarify, because I'm not really getting the full picture here and I feel like I'm making an assumption. When we start to lean into those types of conversations, then we will mitigate so much harm in our communication, our interactions with each other. And we can chunk this down to the microcosm of an individual relationship. You to a spouse, you to a coworker, you to your care provider, you to a patient or a customer or a client, you to a child as a parent or to a sibling or to a parent, right? Or you can chunk this up to a community, to a church, to an organization. And you can even chunk it out to our society and how we interact, even with strangers on a day-to-day basis. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do that with everyone. You don't have to clarify with everyone, but you can also assume, because if you're driving in a car and someone comes into your lane, you can assume that they intended to do it, or you could assume they weren't paying attention, or you could assume that maybe you were in their blind spot and they simply didn't see you. You never know what kind of day a person's having until you interact with them and clarify and verify. So I think it's important for us to begin to become aware of our own thought processes, of our own assumptions, of our own tendency to make meanings. And it's also wise to think about what are the kinds of meanings that you tend to make. Do you tend to assume malintent first, or do you tend to assume good intentions first? Do you tend to distrust, or do you tend to grant trust until trust is broken? And there's no wrong way to do it. Just understand there are consequences to that. And oftentimes, if you tend toward distrust, if you tend towards assuming malintentions, there may be something in the background. There may be some place of harm or wound or trauma that needs to be healed. And so, with that said, what I want us to become aware of as community is to become aware of the assumptions that we're making, and in every moment understand that we have an opportunity to recognize our assumptions and clarify and verify, not assume and thwart. We don't have to. We can rethink assuming intent. We can rethink assuming meaning, and we can rethink assuming authority. And what that means is, if you are listening to someone, or if you see something posted, or if you're in a meeting and something is said, and it's said by someone who might be assumed to be a higher authority, but for you it doesn't sound or quite feel right, then you have the opportunity to challenge that. You have the opportunity to clarify, to check it, to inquire about the accuracy of what's said. All right, so these are the practices that you can go with for the week, or for the next couple of weeks, however long you want to practice them. And I invite comments and questions and experiences that you might have as you practice these tools. Okay, and of course, as I said earlier, if you found this to be valuable, please share it. Share it with someone you know who needs it, and just share it with someone who you think might find it valuable. And feel free to leave a comment, leave a review, leave a 5-star review if you truly enjoy the podcast, and remember to subscribe. And so, you all know how to get in touch with me if, in fact, you would like for me to facilitate these types of conversations inside your organization. I do workshops inside of the organization with regard to building psychological safety for those moments of challenge, with regard to communication, navigating conflict, navigating difficult conversations, or even building emotional intelligence for communication. If you'd like for me to facilitate any of those conversations or workshops or cohorts, I'm happy to do that. Reach out to me here on this platform that you're listening, or you can go to mindremappingacademy.com. All right? So take these tools with you. I look forward to our next time together. And until the next time I see you, stay empowered.